It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Parkinson, who's going to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening. Dr. Parkinson is the Senior Medical Director for Health and Productivity for UPMC Health Plan and Work Partners. And it's, Michael, I'd love to have you just give a great introduction for Dr. Hayes.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Sarah, and thanks all of our colleagues here at FIPS. What a delight to come here and participate in this really, I think, internationally unique program. And I think we sometimes underestimate how impactful and how innovative the programs that come out of FIPS and the broader Pittsburgh community are. So thank you for your leadership. I do have to point out, if Gabe is still here, you don't have time to be here, Gabe. You got so much work to do out there to get those stars on the map, so you got to leave. No, I'm just kidding. That's quite a job. You guys, that's something. Well, this is a personal privilege for me to welcome Dr. Frank Hu back to Pittsburgh. I have been admiring and crisscrossing Dr. Hu's path for many, many years. And invariably at any given time on my desk and informing what I talk to physicians across Pittsburgh and the country is his work. So let me give you kind of the formal background and then a little personal observation, if I may, without embarrassing Frank. Dr. Frank Hu is chair of the Department of Nutrition and the Frederick J. Stair Professor of Nutrition and Epidemiology at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. He is also professor of medicine, Harvard Medical School, Brigham and Women's Hospital. He serves as co-director of the program in obesity epidemiology and prevention at Harvard and director of Boston Nutrition and Obesity Research Center, Epidemiology and Genetics Core, increasing convergence there. He received his MD from Tongji Medical College in China and is a recipient and his Ph.D. in epidemiology from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Dr. Hu is the recipient of the Kelly West Award for Outstanding Achievement in Epidemiology by the American Diabetes Association, and he was also named the American Heart Association's Ansel Keys Memorial Lecturer in 2018. If you know anything about the history of healthy eating and lifestyle medicine, Ansel Keys is a name that you will remember, an icon. He has served on the Institute of Medicine Committee on preventing the global epidemic of cardiovascular disease, the American Heart Association American College of Cardiology Obesity Guideline Expert Panel, and the 2015 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee of the USDA and Health and Human Services. He currently serves on the editorial boards of many journals, and most importantly, he is a member of the National Academy of Medicine, our country's highest scientific honor for physicians and scientists. But that's just his CV. What I've been curious to know is about the consummate professional, extremely productive and generous professional that Frank is. And I called up several colleagues who will remain nameless. And I said, if I could just say something that really speaks to the person and the contribution and how he thinks, what would I say? And without attribution, one of my colleagues said, despite being one of the, and arguably the most prominent nutritional epidemiologist in the world, Frank is incredibly modest. When he speaks, and rightly so, the world listens. What those who don't know him well may not know is that he is far more often quiet, listening attentively, considering carefully. He's an inspiration to all who value science in the service of truth and understanding. We are indeed fortunate tonight. We get to hear Dr. Hu speak, and Frank, I guarantee you, we will be listening for the sake of human health, animal health, and the health of our planet. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Frank Hu.
Thank you, Michael, for this very generous introduction and also kind introduction. Invitation. Fortunately, I had only one glass of wine, so I think I should be able to finish my talk with no problem. And it's also a special treat for me because, I mean, this is the first time I'm speaking inside of a botanic garden, right? Certainly not a very good place to do food fight. So we're going to talk about science, we're going to talk about policies. I was given almost impossible task to talk about personal health, population health, and planetary health. But I think this is basically the One Health concept, right? We want to integrate our personal health with the health of our populations, our communities, with the health of planet. So I think we are all aware of the triple threats we are facing in the world, which include obesity, undernutrition, and climate change. If you look at the world population, currently we have 2 billion people who have some form of micronutrient deficiency, especially deficiency in iron and vitamin A. And almost 200 million children are stunted or wasted. 200 million people, children are stunted or wasted. On the other hand, we have 2 billion adults who are overweight or obese. That's another form of malnutrition. In the meantime, we have more than 40 million children who are overweight or obese. And so all those problems in terms of undernutrition, malnutrition, and obesity are collected to our environment, collected to climate change. So that's why I think it's very important to tackle all those problems in the context of environmental sustainability and climate change. Another major challenge, of course, the world population is growing very rapidly. Currently, we have about 7 billion people on the planet. But in the next 2 or 3 decades, the population will grow to almost 10 billion people. So the challenge we are facing is how to feed 10 billion people in 2050, which is healthy and also environmentally sustainable. And the usual response, of course, is just to grow more foods, grow more grains, and then feed the grains to animals, and then people just eat the animals, right? That's the usual response. But this kind of response is not going to work in the current environment, and also it's not going to be sustainable and healthy to feed 10 billion people in 20 to 30 years. And that's why the EAT-Lancet Commission report is so important. It's a landmark report because it has taken a more systems approach, multi-step approach to tackle this huge problem. My colleague and also my predecessor at Harvard, Walter Willett, was the co-chair of the EAT-Lancet Commission. And this commission included more than 30 international experts in food systems, in nutrition, in environment, and they spent almost 3 years to develop this report. So the first step of this committee did is to define what is a healthy diet, right? I mean, there's so many different kinds of diets. Is the Atkins diet a healthy diet? Is the ketogenic diet a healthy diet? Is the low-fat diet a healthy diet? And so the first step is to define a healthy reference diet using the best available evidence from randomized clinical trials, large cohort studies, and human feeding studies, and so on and so forth. And the second step is to define planetary boundaries based on several key environmental systems and process parameters, such as greenhouse gas emissions, land use, water use, and so on and so forth. And the third step is to apply a global systems modeling framework to analyze measures that can be implemented to stay within the food production boundaries while still delivering health benefits for human populations. And finally, the Commission recommended several strategies, international strategies, to achieve the changes needed to meet the goal of healthy diet from sustainable systems by 2050. So it's very groundbreaking and very ambitious project that the Commission has taken in the past several years. The basic approach that the Commission has used, and also the approach we have been using more and more in our own work, is the systems approach to nutrition and human and planetary health. Through this approach, we considered multiple factors, including ecological factors, health factors, social factors, and economical factors, together holistically across time and across space. And it's very important to integrate different layers of factors when we consider human and planetary health. So those layers include our cellular mechanisms, molecular mechanisms, and individual health, population health, and also our ecosystem. So it's very important to integrate all those different layers, different levels of factors together when we tackle the major challenge of human health and the health of the planet. So how do we know we are eating a healthy diet? Is there an app for that? Do you have an app for you to say whether you are eating a healthy diet? No, there is no such an app. We have an app for everything, but not for our diet, the quality of our diet. In the past 15, 20 years, we have developed a metric or score or index to quantify the quality of our diets. It's called the Healthy Eating Index or Alternative Healthy Eating Index. And this score includes 10 different components based on how much whole grains you eat, how much fruits and vegetables you eat, how much omega-3 you consume, and how much red meat, how much sugar you consume, and so on and so forth. And we use the 10 components to develop a metric to quantify individuals and populations' diet quality. So the perfect score is 100. I don't know any of you would score 100, but almost no one in the world has scored 100 so far based on the data we have analyzed. So what is the average diet score for the world? The average is 50, 50 out of 100, which is very bad. I mean, that would be a D or F, if, right? If you give a report card. And in the past 2 decades, there is only a slight improvement in diet quality globally from a score of 45 to a score of 50. But overall, the diet quality in the world remains very poor. So if you look at the global picture, the diet quality varies a lot from country to country, from population to populations. The regions with the green or light green, blue colors are rated to have a relatively higher diet quality. So which countries, which regions have relatively higher diet quality? Not surprisingly, the countries along the Mediterranean Sea tend to have higher diet quality. The Caribbean countries tend to have higher diet quality. Several East Asian countries tend to have higher diet quality. How about the US? So where do we stand in terms of the diet quality globally? Not so good, right? Below average. Below average. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of improving our overall diet quality. We conducted a statistical analysis to estimate how many deaths that could be prevented if the global diet quality improved from about 50 to about 75. I mean, it's not a huge improvement, but it's a sizable improvement. We estimate that this kind of improvement in global diet could prevent 12 million premature deaths annually. 12 million. So that's 20% of the total deaths in the world. Each year, 20% of total deaths in the world. For women, it's about 5.5 million. For men, it's 6.1 million. And most of the deaths are attributable to chronic diseases, including cancer, cardiovascular disease, pulmonary disease, neurodegenerative diseases, and so on and so forth. So this means that improvement in our diet could substantially reduce risk of chronic diseases and also reduce mortality due to those diseases. Before I talk about the Planetary Health diet, I'm going to just quickly go over some of the evidence that we have accumulated so far in terms of diet and health. Much of the scientific evidence on diet and health come from large population-based studies, randomized clinical trials, and the human feeding studies. In the past several decades, we have been tracking hundreds of thousands of nurses and health professionals around the country in the US to measure their diet, their lifestyle, and their health conditions on a regular basis. So the Nurses' Health Study started in 1976. They have been followed for more than 4 decades. And the majority of the participants are still staying with us unless they die. Unfortunately, more than 40% of the participants have already died. But for the rest of the participants, more than 90% of them are still with us. This is really remarkable. And we have also collected a massive amount of biospecimens, including DNA samples, urine samples, blood samples. And currently, we just started a major undertaking to collect 20,000 stool samples, poop samples from the participants to conduct microbiome analysis to see how our diet influences the microbiome in our gut and how the bacteria in our gut influence immune functions, inflammation, and the chronic diseases. So this kind of studies have provided enormous power for us to link what we eat to our health, to our biological mechanisms in terms of genetic effects and changes in microbiome and changing immune function and so on and so forth. So some of you may have seen this sensational headlines, eat butter, butter is back. Is butter really back? So how many of you think butter is really back? Okay, there are a few. So the question is, is butter healthy or not? But the main thing that has been lost in the debate is what is butter compared to, right? Compared to what? So that's the essence of our nutritional epidemiological analysis. When we look at saturated fat, we have to compare it to something else. Typically, when we increase or decrease saturated fat intake, we have to change other components of the diet. For example, we may use olive oil to replace butter, right? That's one possibility. Another possibility is that when you cut back on your steak and fats, you may just eat more bagels or muffins because those are low fat, right? So which one is better, is associated with better health outcomes? And in this study, we found that if you replace saturated fat or butter with unsaturated fats from olive oil, avocado, nuts, seeds, seafood, you have significantly lower risk of heart disease. Significantly lower risk of heart disease. So clearly, butter is not a better option than olive oil or canola oil or nuts, seeds, or omega-3 from seafood. On the other hand, if you replace butter with just more carbohydrate, refined starch, you cut back on your butter and perhaps drinking more soda and eating more white bread. That's not going to do you any good in terms of heart disease risk. Actually, people who eat high saturated fat diet and those who eat high refined carbohydrate, added sugar diet have the same risk of heart disease. So it means that saturated fat and the refined carbohydrates and the added sugar are both bad for heart disease, just in different ways. So I think, again, the main question is compared to what, and what is the comparison or replacement nutrient? For mortality or longevity, what we found is that trans fat is the worst type of fat, which is not surprising. But saturated fat, mostly coming from animal products, is also associated with increased risk of mortality. On the other hand, if you consume polyunsaturated fats or monounsaturated fats from plant-based oils, nuts, seeds, and seafood, there is a significant benefit in terms of reducing premature deaths or improving longevity. The evidence on red meat and adverse health outcomes has accumulated substantially in the past 2 decades. In our cohorts, increased consumption of both processed and unprocessed red meat is associated with increased risk of total mortality, cardiovascular mortality, and cancer mortality. The data have been remarkably consistent. So the question is, if you cut back on red meat, what kind of food you can use to replace red meat? In this study, we found that if you replace red meat, just 1 serving per day of red meat, with other protein foods such as nuts, legumes, low-fat dairy, or poultry or fish, there is about 7 to 19% reduced risk of mortality. And we estimated that if everyone in the U.S., adults in the U.S., reduce their red meat consumption to half serving per day or 1 serving every other day, 10% of premature deaths in men and 8% premature deaths in women could have been prevented. So we're not talking about everyone becoming vegetarian or vegan. We're talking about just cutting back consumption of red meat from currently about 1 to 1.5 serving per day to about half serving per day. There are going to be substantial reduction in premature deaths and improved longevity. There is also very consistent evidence on the relationship between red meat consumption and type 2 diabetes, especially processed red meat, such as sausage, bacon, and other processed red meat. 1 serving per day is associated with about 30% increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes. Processed red meat has also been declared as a carcinogen because regular consumption of processed red meat is associated with increased risk of colorectal cancer. Different types of protein have divergent effects on our health. Animal protein tend to be associated with increased risk of chronic disease and also cardiovascular mortality. On the other hand, consumption of plant-based protein is associated with much better health outcomes, including lower risk of diabetes, heart disease, and also mortality. Many randomized clinical trials have looked at the effects of plant-based protein foods on blood cholesterol. So there are several dozens of studies that look at whether incorporating nuts into your diet can reduce your bad cholesterol. And all those studies most of those studies have found that if you incorporate nuts into your diet, there is a significant benefit in terms of lowering your total and the LDL cholesterol. Almost 40 studies have been conducted on different types of nuts, walnuts, almonds, peanuts, pistachios, and so on. So all the results are very consistent. Since all the nuts have some beneficial effects on our health, the only exception is donuts. So, fortunately, we don't have anything on donuts here. So, and other protein foods, plant-based protein foods like soy and legumes have also been found to have beneficial effects on cardiovascular risk factors. So those results are very consistent with what we found in large population-based cohort studies. The largest randomized clinical trials on diet and health was conducted by a group of investigators in Spain. This is the so-called PlantBased study. It's a huge study which randomized more than 7,000 patients into 3 different groups: Mediterranean diet with extra virgin olive oil, Mediterranean diet with mixed nuts every day, and then the control group was given advice to eat a low-fat diet. So they followed those participants for 4 to 5 years, and at the end of the trial, they found that people who consume Mediterranean diet with olive oil or nuts had 30% reduced risk of cardiovascular disease compared to the control group, 30% reduction among people who did not have a heart attack or stroke before. So this benefit is very similar to the benefit you would get from the best cardiovascular drug, which is a statin, right? And of course, statins have side effects. And on the other hand, this kind of healthy diet not only benefit cardiovascular health, but also benefit other chronic disease outcomes such as diabetes and even some cancers. So I think this type of studies has provided very strong evidence that changing our diet can go a long way in terms of improving our health. One lesson we have learned in our studies is that not all plant-based diets are healthy, because when people talk about environmentally sustainable diet, they tend to recommend plant-based diet or vegetarian diet or vegan diet. But what we found is that a lot of people are actually consuming unhealthy plant-based diets. So in these 2 studies, we look at 2 types of plant-based diet. One type is rich in fruits and vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, and other healthy plant-based foods. And those people experienced significantly lower risk of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. On the other hand, a lot of people consume a plant-based diet with a lot of refined carbohydrates. As I just mentioned, I mean, most people eat white bread, bagels as they are stable carbohydrates, and they drink a lot of sugary beverages, and some people eat pizza. I mean, it's basically loaded with refined carbohydrates and sodium. So this kind of typical so-called Western style plant-based diets are actually not healthy. This kind of plant-based diet is actually worse than the omnivore diet with relatively high amount of animal products. So I think when we talk about plant-based diet, we have to be very specific about what kind of plant-based foods should be included in our diet. When we look at weight gain and obesity, we found that different types of foods the quality of food make a huge difference in terms of promoting weight gain. Most people gain weight during young adulthood and middle adulthood. The amount of weight gain is very small. It's about 1 pound per year, and almost unnoticeable by individuals. But over time, the amount of weight gain can accumulate and become very significant health problem later on. So in this study, what we found is that some of the most obesogenic foods are plant-based foods, like potatoes, French fries, even potato chips, and desserts, and sugar-sweetened beverages. So those are highly processed, ultra-processed foods which are abundant in our food system, and they're cheap and they are widely accessible. On the other hand, increasing consumption of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, nuts, and seeds, legumes actually slow down weight gain among adults. So that's, I think, a very important public health message. So those kind of foods are not only beneficial for cardiometabolic health, they can also play a role in terms of delaying age-related weight gain. In the past 5 to 10 years, there has been increasing interest in the area called personalized nutrition or precision nutrition. Each of us carry a lot of different genes, and those genes may make us metabolize some foods much faster or slower depending on the genotypes. So how many of you really don't like broccoli, really hate broccoli? No one? So if you really don't like broccoli, okay, you shouldn't blame yourself. You should blame your parents, because there is a broccoli gene make you have a very strong bitter aftertaste after you consume broccoli. And how many of you think you have a sweet tooth? Okay, so many of you, again, blame your parents, okay? There is this gene, FGF21 genotype is associated with sugar craving or craving highly refined carbohydrates. And there are also genes that make you more jittery after drinking a cup of coffee. And of course, the genes make you have alcohol flash reactions. I don't know how many of you have that. Now, in Asians, more than 50% people carry the alcohol flashing genotypes. So most people would have a very quick reaction in terms of their red face after drinking alcohol. Is because they carry the genotypes make them difficult to metabolize alcohol. So all this kind of information, I think, is useful in terms of making more informed decisions about what kind of food or drinks you want to consume and to avoid. And I think some of the genetic information can be also useful in terms of treatment. For example, for individuals who have this very rare genetic mutation develop PKU, phenylketonuria, which is a devastating genetic condition. And those infants, of course, cannot consume any phenylalanine in their diet, and they have to be put on phenylalanine-free diet to survive. So that's, of course, the genetic information extremely important for treatment and for survival of the individuals who carry the genes. But the main question is whether having all this kind of genetic information can improve individual health and population health. At this point, we don't have much empirical evidence from large-scale studies yet. Several years ago, a group in Israel conducted a very interesting study. So they collected a massive amount of data from a cohort of 800 people, 800, a very large population. Those data include microbiome data, your blood test, questionnaire data, your food, diary, and so on and so forth. And then they put all the data into machine learning algorithm. It's like artificial intelligence. And then they come up with this algorithm will tell the participants what kind of food to eat, what kind of food to avoid in order for them to control their postprandial blood sugar. And it turns out this algorithm works much better than the dietitian, than the human. So basically, this is, I guess, first example in which AI is smarter than the human in terms of telling a patient how to control their blood sugar. Is that too good to be true? So maybe very soon you will ask Alexa, what should I eat, right? Right? So you're going to have an AI diet instead of a human diet. But before you get too excited, I think there are many unanswered questions, and there's still a long way to go before this kind of technology can be used in clinical practice. So the question is, can this result be generalized to other health outcomes? Because this study is focused on optimizing blood sugar. Blood sugar, of course, is important, but it's just one of many health parameters that matter for disease outcomes, right? How about blood pressure? How about your body weight? And how about some other biochemical parameters like inflammation, insulin resistance, and so on and so forth. So optimizing for blood pressure, blood sugar doesn't necessarily mean that your other health risks will be minimized. And then the second question is, can the results be generalized to other populations? Of course, this study was conducted in the Israeli population with very different food systems from ours. And it's hard to know whether this kind of results can be generalized to the US population. And the third question, of course, is this feasible in clinical practice? At this point, it's not feasible in the US, at least based on the current healthcare system. And thinking about collecting the stool samples and analyzing those samples, and then using the computer algorithm to generate the meal plans for the patients. I think that's almost like science fiction at this point, at least in the US. But other countries, especially in Israel and in Europe, they're kind of moving toward that direction. Nevertheless, this study inspired a startup company called Day 2. And if you pay $350, you can get your microbiome test, and then you can get an app to tell you what kind of foods you should eat, what kind of food you can avoid, you should avoid. So how many of you are willing to pay $350 and send your stool samples to this company and then get an app for your meal plan? Anyone? Well,
Sure.
Yeah, let me know what will happen. There's no data at this point whether this works or not in real life. And how many of you have done 23andMe? Okay, a few of them, and you pay $200, you get your ancestry analysis and also genetic testing for now more than 10 different diseases, including obesity, diabetes, heart disease, some cancers, and so on and so forth. But the question is, how are you going to use the genetic information, right? So if the report tells you that you have 20% increased risk of developing diabetes in the next 10 years, what are you going to do? Are you going to modify your diet? You're going to be more physically active? Or maybe you just threw up your hand. I cannot do anything. This is my genetic destiny. So I think this kind of information, this kind of knowledge is interesting. The question is how it can be translated into your daily life and in clinical practice to improve the health outcomes of the individuals or family members. I think the main problem with those technologies, even though they are incredibly exciting, they don't address the root causes of our health problems, which is the obesogenic environment and the SAD diet. Do you know what SAD stands for?
Yes, Standard American Diet.
Yeah, it's pretty sad, right? Yeah, if we look at our food environment, I mean, the just incredibly toxic. I mean, all kinds of fast food and widely accessible, cheap starch foods and snacks loaded with added sugar, sodium, and unhealthy fats. And the portion size is just inhumane. If you go to a movie theater, you get half a gallon of soda and get a refill, almost, 1,000 calories. You have to run half marathon to burn all those calories. But I mean, you're sitting there for 3 or 4 hours and drinking all the soda and consume all those calories. I think, this kind of food environment is sick, and that make our health system sick. And I think, again, even though all those technologies are exciting, they are not addressing the root cause of our health problem. So in the era of precision medicine, I think we really need to balance the investment in precision medicine research with limited resources for public health. We should also manage realistically high expectations and overpromise of precision medicine and precision nutrition. There is just so much hype about precision medicine and precision nutrition, but the empirical data is not there yet. And of course, we still need population-based approaches, such as education policies and regulations to improve our food environment. So what kind of public health strategies are effective in improving our food environment? Banning trans fat, I think, is a great example, successful example of using public health nutrition to improve population health. Soda tax has been also effective, at least in some cities, countries, to reduce consumption of sugary beverages. We should also increase agriculture subsidies to increase affordability of healthy food. We should restrict fast food marketing, especially to children, and we also need to improve nutrition labeling. So I think all those strategies are very important and necessary to improve our toxic, obesogenic food environment. Philadelphia becomes first major city to tax soda. What has happened to Pittsburgh? Why not Pittsburgh? Have you tried?
Said it was a bridge too far right
now. Okay. Anyway, so right now, 10 cities in the U.S. have implemented soda tax. I think the preliminary data are very promising. Berkeley is the first city or town to implement soda tax, and there is significant reduction in consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages and increasing consumption of water. I was wondering who in Berkeley are drinking soda, right? They're all kind of middle, upper class people, and but it turns out there's still a lot of people in Berkeley who drink soda. And in Mexico, the soda tax has been quite effective in reducing consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages, especially in poor people. I think that where the tax can be most effective, because people with lower socioeconomic status, they are more vulnerable to obesity-related health outcomes, and they also have higher consumption of sugary beverages. So if they can reduce consumption of sugary beverages and consume healthy alternatives that can have significant benefit on health outcomes and also on the healthcare cost. I had the privilege to sit on the 2015 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. Every 5 years, the federal government update the dietary guidelines for Americans. Those guidelines have enormous impact on public health policies, on agricultural policies, school lunch programs, SLAP, and so on and so forth. So we spent 2 years reviewing and synthesizing the vast amount of literature on diet and health, and we developed a scientific report. It's called Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee Scientific Report. In this report, we had a whole chapter on diet and the environmental sustainability. My colleague and I actually did a systematic review on healthy dietary patterns and the environmental sustainability, whether they align with each other. What we found is that dietary patterns high in plant-based foods, lower in animal-based foods, and lower in total energy are not just healthier, but also more sustainable. Meat was identified as the food with the greatest impact on the environment, which is not surprising. And we also found that sustainable diet meet the dietary guidelines can be achieved without completely eliminating meat or dairy products and without increasing consumer costs. Because one concern has been that the healthy foods are going to be more expensive, more affordable, especially for poor individuals. But what we found is that a sustainable diet can be affordable, accessible for the majority of the population. But our recommendations on environmental sustainability did not sit very well with the meat industry. You can see the headlines. Attack on meat has industry seeing red. This is a very angry person, can tell. And Congress was not happy either. So Congress to nutritionists do not talk about the environment. So it was very unfortunate because we spent so much time putting together the report, but all the recommendations on environmental sustainability were removed when our scientific report was translated into the official dietary guidelines. And that's a huge missed opportunity because other countries have already adopted dietary recommendations, not just based on human health, but also based on environmental sustainability. And our recommendation on limiting red meat consumption was also watered down. And if you look at the official guidelines, it still include meat as part of the healthy dietary pattern. So, I think for me, it's still very worthwhile and a rewarding experience, but it's also interesting experience politically because that's something we didn't anticipate as a scientist. Currently, the 2020 Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee is going through the same process as we did 5 years ago. But I don't think the environmental sustainability recommendations will come back to the dietary guidelines given the current political environment. So coming back to the EAT-Lancet report, I think it's really bold because, again, it's the first time that the recommendation was made based on both human health and the health of the planet. And this diet recommended by the Commission called Planetary Health Diet could have significant health benefit by reducing premature deaths by almost 20% in the world. And it could also help us to feed 10 billion people with a healthy and sustainable diet in the next 2 to 3 decades. So what kind of diet is the Planetary Health diet? So this is the reference Planetary Health diet defined by the Commission based on 2,500 calories per day. I'm not going to go through all the numbers, but the main idea of this diet is that it recommends much higher consumption of plant-based foods, fruits and vegetables, whole grains, nuts, and so on and so forth. Much lower consumption of animal products, especially red meat. Some people have complained a very low amount of red meat recommended by the Commission, only 14 grams per day. So it's like you can only meet this kind of recommendation by eating a burger for the whole week, one burger for the whole week. But I think it's very important to point out that this is not a rigid prescription. It's very flexible because it has a range in terms of for each of the food items recommended by the Commission. So individuals and also populations can adapt this reference diet according to their own food preferences, cultural preferences, and local situations. I think there are two main dietary shifts that have been recommended by the Commission. One is a 50% reduction in red meat and added sugar consumption, 50% reduction, which is huge. And I talk about the reduction, cutting back red meat in the US population to half serving per day. And this is even more than that. So I think this is a very bold recommendation, very ambitious recommendation. And another important shift is to double the production or consumption of healthy plant-based foods, such as fruits and vegetables, legumes, nuts, and so on and so forth. As I mentioned earlier, it's very important to tailor those targets to local situations. For example, in the US, we consume much more meat than people in Africa or in Southeast Asian countries. And in some of the Southeast Asian countries, they still have a huge problem of protein malnutrition, iron malnutrition deficiency, and so on and so forth. So we're not talking about limiting red meat consumption for those kind of populations. So I think the recommendations are flexible and can be adapted according to individuals' preferences and also to countries' local situations. So the question is, how can we translate those recommendations into practice? How many of you have attended the Manual of Change conference? Well, so this is an initiative we developed several years ago in partnership with the Culinary Institute of America to promote the business of healthy, sustainable, and delicious food choices. So this, the mission or the goal of this initiative is to integrate optimal nutrition, public health, environmental, and social responsibility concerns within the food service industry. And our goal is to establish an agenda for the industry through leadership summits. We have annual leadership summits, reports and tours and guidance for food service professionals. Because without the partnership with food service industry, I think it's very difficult for us to translate those recommendations into people's daily life. And our goal is to demonstrate that changing menus from the current sad diet to a more healthy, sustainable diet is not just can not just improve public health, but also can be a good business, right? I think, of course, the industry want to their food business to be profitable, and I think the message here is that healthy food choices can be profitable if they're done right. So our vision is to make healthy food choices to be healthy and environmentally sustainable and socially responsible, and also delicious, right? If you have very healthy food on your plate, if they don't taste good, then consumers are not going to like them, and the food industry is not going to make them. So I think it's very important to combine nutritional sciences, culinary sciences, environmental sustainability together if we want to translate the planetary health diet into practice. This is the plant-forward diet being promoted by the Manual of Change. This is a style of cooking and eating that emphasizes and celebrates, but it's not limited to plant-based foods that I mentioned earlier. And this kind of diet reflects evidence-based principles of health and sustainability. A couple of months ago, my son, who is a senior at Cornell, sent me this picture. He said he took it in his student dining hall. So I was very happy to see that. So it means that our messages have spread to college campuses. And I think this is very, very important, very significant, and because this can have important impact or influence on the palate, on the preference, and also on the plate of our next generations. So I think the next generation is incredibly important for the One Health and the One Planet initiative. So finally, I just want to put all this together, and I talk about personalized nutrition or precision nutrition. I talk about public health nutrition. I talk about sustainable nutrition, but our goal, eventual goal, is to improve personal health, population health, and planetary health. In the past, we have looked at each of the areas in isolation and separately, but now we know they are all integrated, and we have to look at our own health, community, the health of our communities, the populations, the health of our planet in a more integrated way. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Hu, for that really wonderful and insightful presentation. It's amazing how much we know about food and how much we don't know about food. And then when you throw politics into the mix, it really gets confusing. And I really appreciate your bringing together the idea of personal, community, and planetary health. And I thought that was really great for you to do that for us. We have time for one or two questions. Yes.
Well, thank you very much for this presentation. And I want to just emphasize how important one picture was when you showed the infrastructure of Cranberry Township, so to speak, next to Pittsburgh. No sidewalks, no bicycle paths,
Yeah.
transportation, only junk food.
Yeah.
And so we have a colleague who works on the GIS system for Pittsburgh. And one can take a map of Pittsburgh and see where the kids go to school, how do they come back home, and if they find a local shop with local food. No. And in many poor neighborhoods, come home and they watch television and they get fat.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think, that's why we always say that the zip code is more important than genetic code, because where you live makes a huge difference in terms of your health. So even though we now have fascinating technologies for genetic analysis, but where you live, your zip code is enormously important in terms of food choices and health outcomes. Yeah, thank you for the comment.
Collaborating with this kind of a context that the FIPS is and other contexts in the city, and you saw local food production in poor neighborhoods is extremely important.
Right.
Thank you very much for the talk, Dr. Hu. I'm Terry Collins. I'm a chemist at Carnegie Mellon University. the talk focuses very much on the actual nature of the food and the way we tend to think about it. But it seems to me there's another dimension, the chemicals that we add to the food. And for example, you could have regarded, I suppose, as a perturbation on a main theme, but it would seem to me that it may be the main theme. For example, we know from work you're probably aware of Shana Swan and Hagar Levine that we've lost 54% of Western man sperm count since 1973. And these are associated with chemicals that we excrete when we go to the bathroom. Yeah. And that produce these effects in rodents and other animals at the concentrations we're excreting them. So how does the food industry and the food academia integrate the unbelievable power of these chemicals into your thinking?
Yeah, this is absolutely a very important area. I think, as you said, I mean, foods are the natural vehicles for those pollutants and chemicals enter our body. And many studies have shown that endocrine disruptors, as you mentioned earlier, have a significant impact on not just reproductive health, but also obesity, immune system, and even breast cancer. I have several colleagues at Harvard School of Public Health who are looking at the intersections between those chemicals or the pollutants and the food system. And what we have found is that many of the chemicals that have been found to be harmful in animal models turn out to be also detrimental for human health. For example, we measured the bisphenol A metabolites and phthalate metabolites in urine samples, and we were able to use those measurements to predict future risk of obesity and type 2 diabetes. So this kind of combination of high load of harmful chemicals in our food system and a very bad quality of our food system, I think is a double whammy. And that create even more synergistic harmful effects on our health and also on the health of the planet.
Okay, I think we've run out of time. So thank you very much for your talk. And Dr. Hu will be here for a little bit longer. If you want to talk, we have about another half hour. If you want to have conversation, there's still some refreshments. Also, Dr. Hu will be on the panel tomorrow, the first panel tomorrow, so if they have an opportunity to ask more questions then. So thank you all very much for joining us. Hopefully we'll see most of you tomorrow. Thanks.